chapter 3.8, part 2. So we're still in realism, but we are in a slightly different subject matter. This group, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, they formed in 1848, English painters and writers. And what they're doing is showing fictional figures or figures from the medieval era. They're rejecting the salon, they're rejecting the academy in terms of portraying the Greek and Roman classical themes. They're choosing things like this is Ophelia from Shakespeare's Hamlet, and she drowns herself, and it was kind of important to depict her, so it's a different sort of a realism, if that makes sense. A fictional character portrayed very realistically. And in this case, he's using accurate plant matter. He really studies this scene, and that really looks like a tree that's hanging over water. It's really quite stunning. And his model, this woman that posed for him, she was in a bathtub with a dress on, and she caught a severe cold. I mean, that's pretty impressive. But he was trying to get accurate depiction. But see, the other thing you want to notice here is that they're coming up with some different scenarios. I mean, a body, a human in water with clothing on in this manner has not been painted before, not in this way. So he's inspired by medieval subject matter, and he's depicting a scene from a play. Still in realism here, but kind of a different look to the work. It's got a real polished look to it. Nameless and Friendless, and this is from the Academy of Arts, London, 1857, female artist, and she was involved in women's suffrage. I'm on page 506, but it shows a woman in mourning trying to sell her work to a local dealer, and she doesn't have a man in her life to escort her. I'm kind of paraphrasing a little bit here, but another realist painter, kind of a sort of frustrating scene. We're hoping it goes well, but there's some people looking on because they know that she is alone in the world. So she's one of the few female artists to make it into the British Academy. She had to petition, to allow. They had to petition to allow women to study, and shows the struggle. So now we're going to get into photography for just a minute. We're not really going to delve too far into it, but we're going to understand its relevancy in terms of the mid-1800s. So portraiture, which normally was the painter's living, and that was their meat and potatoes, as it were. That's the thing that they were responsible for up until this time. We're now becoming things that photographers did in a couple of minutes. So you used to sit for a portrait to be painted, taking many weeks or sometimes months, depending on how complex it was. And artists are starting to lose that income, right? And then this debate of who is the recorder of history. And remember, our academy is all about the painters recording history. And then artists are kind of like, well, that's not really our role anymore. What are we going to be doing? So could portraits be made with a camera instead of with art? And we see Alexander Gardner photographing Abraham Lincoln and his son Thomas, also known as Tad, here in 1865. And remember, the Civil War is the first war to be photographed and shown to people, and they know the horrors of war. Not firsthand, but not through just verbal remembrances, but actual images. So here we have this presidential portrait now taken with a photograph. He had 40 photographs of himself taken, and this is kind of how Americans got to know him and support his politics. So early on, photography is promoting and familiarizing. Because we have today, like with Instagram, we feel like we know someone because we're looking at a photograph, right? It's getting into our homes, it's getting into our hands. We're getting an intimacy with somebody. Whereas before, if there was a singular painted portrait, right, in a building, you would have to have gone into that building in a specific location. Photography is able to be replicated and spread around. Rare smile for Lincoln. Now here is Thomas Leclerc commenting on this idea of accuracy in photography, right? He's got this backdrop and this scene with these two kids, and he actually does a painting. And there's a photographer here setting up a scene. But kind of what's happening here is this kid, the boy, died at 26, and his sister died in years prior, right? So this photo is a fake in the sense that these children were not this age or even alive when the canvas was painted. So it's a memorial, and the painting is kept, is a better way to keep a memory than a photograph. So he's kind of talking about the illusion of photography versus painting. But this is not uncommon. We have to remember how frequent and how common it was for children to die, children to get to 18 or 20. The numbers were quite low. I don't have my statistics in front of me, but kids would die and parents would grieve them. And then, I don't know if you've ever lost a pet or experienced something, or even somebody moving away. Like, you walk into the next room and you think they're there, and then you're like, oh my gosh, wow, that person's not there anymore. But that kind of a mental situation would sometimes happen for parents in particular. So to have a photograph of them knowing that it was made about their death, and this is a common practice for a long time, the Victorian era, where we are right now in 1865, a lot of death and disease and so on going on. So you would have a photograph of them to remember them by, but also knowing that it was about the fact that they died. Thomas Eakins, really beautiful painter. I kind of wish we were looking at one of his paintings instead of his photograph. But the point is, he's using photography now for better accuracy for these motion angles that the body is doing, because a nude model, or even a clothed model for that matter, he couldn't hold this stance, right? It would be very hard to do a painting or sculpture with a figure holding this particular pose. He did a lot of photos of boxing and, I don't know. I want to say wrestling, but I'm not sure that's right. But he did a lot of beautiful flesh, guys with no shirts on, boxing and things like that. Just gorgeous flesh and human scenes and so on. He's a subheading as well, but we don't have this here in the book. I don't want to get too far afield, but at any rate, he's using this to really study anatomy and to get a clearer sense of the body. He also was somebody who was a teacher, and he taught one of our other artists in a couple more pages. So he is not studying the classical nudes, the sculptures that we might have plaster casts of in the academy. He is going for realism, and he is studying through photography and dissections. Now, in figurative work nowadays, in some colleges, you do study cadavers, and you do study the body quite thoroughly. So Muybridge was an early photographer, one of the first photographers afoot, but his thing was motion. He had a bet with somebody. Actually, I don't know if he had the bet or go back to chapter 2.9, and you can look at that image 2.9.3. But there was a bet, and it was settled by, the question was, do the horse's feet all leave at one time from the ground, which is true. I feel like that's so easy to see, so this puzzles me. But anyway, it was a way of capturing motion, the phases of the horse's steps. But this becomes a precursor for moving film, because we realize how many frames per second, and this is several frames. This is a portion of what we're looking at, but we realize that 16 frames per second is what we need to look at